When 5 employees were murdered in 2 separate restaurants, only hours apart, we were all concerned that there was a spree killer on the loose in Central Florida. But when we took a closer look at the actual crime scene, we realized that there were as many differences as there were similarities. The question was, could we interpret the clues in time to catch the killer before he struck again?
Vero Beach, Florida, a sleepy town of retirees on the Treasure Coast. But when residents wake up this balmy spring morning, it's to breaking news.
Nothing was amiss when Dan Long and his wife called Domino's Pizza at 11 p.m. Tuesday, but by midnight he had led police to the scene of a triple shooting.
I ran up to the door and I opened the door and said, "Hello," and no one said anything, so I yelled about 3 more times, and there's just no answer.
Police find the bodies of the restaurant's 3 employees at the back of the store. Detective Don Dappin suddenly finds himself in the middle of a gruesome triple homicide investigation.
Well, when you first walk in the front door, you actually wouldn't see the victims. There's a front counter area and then some pizza ovens and areas where they took orders over the phone. You wouldn't actually observe the victims until you moved towards the rear of the store and actually went around a small corner. Then you could see the bathroom area where the victims were actually positioned when the officers arrived.
The 3 victims have all been shot in the head with a .38 caliber bullet. One of them, a female, has been sexually assaulted. Residents of the tranquil seaside town are stunned, and things are about to get worse. 6 hours later, and about 45 minutes away in neighboring Okeechobee County, an early morning regular arrives for breakfast at Danny's Country Cafe. He takes one look inside and runs straight to the gas station next door to call the police. Okeechobee County Sheriff's Detective George Suttle responds to the scene.
There were 2 victims, 1 male, 1 female. Both victims were lying on the floor, massive lacerations to the throat areas, bound both hands and feet.
Cafe owner Danny Hill and a waitress, Teresa Jones, have been murdered.
There was no indication of struggle. There was no indication of robbery. At the scene, we were unable to determine a clear motive.
5 people have been murdered inside 2 different restaurants in the space of just a few hours. This quiet corner of Central Florida has rarely seen anything like it. And it's not over yet. Investigators find a burned-out car on State Road 60, only a few miles away from the 2 murder scenes. Could the fire have been set on purpose? And if so, what was the perpetrator trying to hide?
It was pretty obvious that an accelerant had been used because of the intense heat that had melted portions of the vehicle itself. Somebody was trying to destroy something or keep somebody from finding out something.
Could that something be evidence of murder? Investigators now fear they have a spree killer heading west, and there's no telling where he'll strike next. With the hours ticking by and no clear leads, local investigators decide they need some additional expertise.
When the profilers were invited to the task force meeting, some of the things we were asked to do was to look at the evidence at the crime scenes and determine whether or not we thought the cases were related and whether or not the killer may be a serial or a spree killer. A serial killer is an individual who generally targets the victims. There's a period of time where there's a selection process that's ongoing. Spree killer will go on a crime spree, essentially, and commit crimes or homicides without having a cooling off period in between the cases. As if it was a spree killer, then there's more urgency because the killer is going to strike sooner.
In Central Florida, 5 people had been murdered in 2 different restaurants, all in the space of just a few hours. And the only clue so far is a burned-out car on the side of the road. In the race for answers, FBI-trained criminal profiler Dale Hinman starts at the beginning. She meets with Detective Dappin to reconstruct the first crime.
This is the kitchen area where they were first approached by the suspects. They were taken back there into the bathroom area where 2 males and a female were shot.
And the motive? The most obvious possibility to consider: money.
Was there any indication that a robbery occurred here?
Yes, we looked in a small office area. We found a desk that had been rifled through along with a safe. There was change on the floor and some money wrappers, which indicated that somebody had rifled through there.
But what kind of robber would also commit this type of murder?
Basically, the appearance of the victims, it appears it's an execution-style murder.
Well, from examining the bullet holes, it looks like they were close contact wounds. Some were even contact wounds. And it appears that they were very close to the victims when they pulled the trigger.
Agent Hinman has seen this type of crime before. Cold, calculating, deadly.
This appears to be a robbery-motivated, very impersonal crime. Whoever committed this crime was an experienced robber who knows the value of not leaving a living witness behind to identify him.
Hinman suggests they look for an experienced criminal, starting with people recently out of prison. Then she turns her attention to the second crime scene, just 45 miles away. Will it point to the same kind of killer? At the cafe, Okeechobee Sheriff's Detective George Suttle walks Agent Hinman through the details of the scene.
The 2 bodies were laying right about here. A few feet separated them. The female was face down. The male was faced up. Both were bound, both hands and feet. There was an extra set of rope.
The placement of the extra rope intrigues investigators. Could it be a clue to the killer's identity?
We had difficulties in the manner in which the rope was laying on the floor, so we sent those to experts thinking it could be some type of cult, something of that nature.
The extra rope remains a mystery, but the facts of the case are simple. The killer entered the restaurant before it opened, bound both victims, and stabbed them to death. The tricky part is figuring out why.
This crime appears to be a very personal crime with targeted victims. The individual came here. He could have killed either of these victims separately. If he had just arrived a little bit earlier, he could have gotten Danny by himself. Or if he had waited in the parking lot, he could have confronted Teresa as she was getting out of her car.
Agent Hinman believes the killer knew exactly who he was going to find here and what he wanted to do to them.
This doesn't appear to be a random case where it was a robbery that the person lost control of the victims and killed them. It appears that the person targeted these victims and wanted to make sure that they were both dead when he left.
To Hinman, the contrast between the 2 crimes is striking.
The murders in the cafe and the murders in the pizzeria appear to be very different. In the pizzeria, the victims were shot to death, and this is a more distant type of crime. But in the cafe, the offender actually tied the victims' hands and feet and was very close to them when he stabbed them to death. This told me the 2 crime scenes were not related, and we were looking for 2 different killers.
At the pizzeria investigation, detectives are pursuing every possible lead.
We got our first big break from a truck driver that had apparently given 2 hitchhikers a ride on State Road 60 in the early morning hours right after our homicide had occurred.
And the hitchhikers had been picked up only miles away from the site of the burned car, which police believe might have been torched by the killer on his way out of town.
The truck driver told us that he thought he had smelled some gasoline on them. So that kind of put them together with the possibility of the car. We weren't positive, we weren't even really sure, but it was just too much of a coincidence to let go by without checking it out.
Dappin sets off to track the mystery hitchhikers across Florida. Meanwhile, back in Okeechobee County, Agent Hinman has developed a strategy for the cafe investigation.
The most confusing aspect of the cafe murders was that there was extra rope. And if this offender actually knew the victims and expected that they would be there, because we saw this as a very passionate crime and that the offender knew the victims, we wondered who the extra rope was for.
Hinman believes that the third piece of rope means there was a third intended victim.
So it was very important to try to determine if there was supposed to be someone else in the restaurant that day and who it would be.
Coming up next, the search for a third potential victim. Will that person unlock the secret of the killer's identity? Investigators in Central Florida are now racing to find 2 sets of killers in 2 unrelated murder cases. Then, just a few days later, there is yet another homicide. Police officers discover the body of a woman near a canal, not far from both of the earlier crime scenes. Is this murder related to either of them? And if so, will it provide a link to one of the killers investigators are searching for? Agent Hinman wants to see the most recent crime scene for herself.
Dale, I was the first responder on scene out here. And upon my arrival, I saw what appeared to be a white female face down in the canal on the other side of the road here on State Road 60.
Was there evidence that she had walked to this area, or footprints or drag marks?
We found tire tracks where she was brought to the scene, probably in a vehicle. There were signs on the road itself that there was a struggle of some type, and drag marks leading from where the body was found down off the edge of the road.
The circumstances appear to be very different from both the pizzeria and cafe murder cases, but Hinman knows to look deeper.
What was the cause of death?
The cause of death in this case, Dale, was a single gunshot wound to the head. The bullet was recovered and appears to be a .38 caliber projectile. This appeared to be an execution-style murder.
This is the second time in 3 days Agent Hinman has heard those words.
Your homicide appears to be much more related to the pizzeria homicide because they're both execution-style homicides with a .38 caliber projectile, even though it's not a robbery. Just the style of the homicide appears related to their case.
Could the pizzeria killer also have killed the woman in the canal? A ballistics test proves it. This crime was committed by the same perpetrator that murdered the 3 pizzeria employees. And detectives may be one step closer to catching that killer, or killers. For nearly a week now, Dappin has been tracking the 2 mysterious hitchhikers west across Florida. All they found so far are a string of vacated motel rooms and false names. But investigators are making headway in another area.
The truck driver who told us he had given 2 individuals a ride across the state came to the police department and gave us a composite of the 2 individuals.
Detectives get their first glimpse of the suspects they're tracking. They still don't have names, but the profile that's emerging helps narrow the field.
The profilers felt that the individual who committed this robbery homicide was criminally sophisticated or experienced, so this was probably a person who had been released from prison or had escaped from prison.
Since hundreds of former prisoners bear some resemblance to the composite drawings, detectives need another link. And they find one.
We also got information from the truck driver that one of them had a southern accent. So we put out a request to all the southern states for records from their prisons on anybody that had been recently released or possibly escaped from prison within the last month or two.
And sure enough, 2 escapees from a North Carolina prison matched the composite drawings. Tommy Wyatt and Michael Lovett are now the investigators' prime suspects. But detectives have lost their trail. The mysterious hitchhikers could be anywhere. Meanwhile, investigators working on the Cafe Double homicide think they may have found the person Agent Hinman suggested they look for, the third intended victim.
Tricia Miller was a roommate of the victim, Teresa Jones. She was to be at work the day that the homicide occurred.
Patricia Miller was a newly hired waitress at the cafe, and detectives soon learned that her ex-husband, Jeffrey Miller, had accused her of having affairs with both of her co-workers. He'd also threatened to kill her.
Patricia Miller had contacted her husband, or her separated husband, a few days prior to the homicide. She had informed him that she was indeed going to go to work at the restaurant on the 18th of March. Circumstances had arose that she was not going that date, but at a later time, but she never relayed that information to Mr. Miller.
Could Miller have gone to the cafe that morning, intending to kill his ex-wife and her 2 co-workers? Detectives want to find out. But when they arrive at his house, Miller has disappeared. When body of evidence returns, 3 suspected killers on the loose, but investigators can't find any of them. Florida investigators are now chasing 3 killers on the run. And detectives believe that hitchhikers Tommy Wyatt and Michael Lovett are responsible for the murders of the pizzeria employees and the woman in the canal. They are exactly the type of perpetrators profiler Dale Hinman expected to find.
The men matched our profile. We thought that they would have a criminal past, and they were prison escapees. They were on the run, so they needed money, and they knew not to leave witnesses alive that could testify against them.
Then, during a routine traffic stop, detectives searching for the hitchhikers get a break.
When he pulled the vehicle over, a white male suspect jumped out of it and took off running into the woods. He then ran the plates to find out who they were registered to, and it came back that the vehicle was stolen, and Wyatt was listed as a suspect.
Officers descend on the scene and begin to comb the area. If the man hiding in the woods is Tommy Wyatt, this is the closest detectives have ever been to catching their killer. After 2 hours of searching, it's all over.
Wyatt finally appeared, came out of the woods, and he just looked like he had had enough, I guess, and surrendered.
But where is his partner, Michael Lovett? A week later, police get their answer.
Lovett checked into a motel where the desk clerk, who apparently also worked at a radio station, had seen and heard about the incident and recognized Lovett as being one of the suspects and staying in the motel. So he called local authorities.
Lovett is also arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. And finally, police locate the suspect in the cafe murders. Jeffrey Miller, the husband of the intended third victim, is in a Louisiana jail after being arrested on an unrelated charge. Investigators devise a plan to find out what he knows about the cafe murders.
Offenders often brag about their crimes when they're in jail or in prison, so investigators very often put snitches into a jail cell to see if an offender will talk or brag about their crimes.
The plan works. The snitch reports that Miller said he killed 2 people in Florida and got away with it. Miller is indicted by a grand jury. But the trial is a different story. Much of the evidence against Miller is circumstantial, and the jury doesn't seem to believe the snitch's testimony. To the dismay of the police, Miller is acquitted of the crime. However, at the trial of the pizzeria and canal murders, the prosecution's case is much stronger. DNA evidence clinches the verdict. Michael Lovett is sentenced to life in prison. Tommy Wyatt receives the death sentence.
One of the more valuable things that a profiler can do to help an investigation is to be able to tell when things are related and when they're not. When we're able to do this, when our experience and our insights help get a case solved faster, this can in some small way help to bring closure to the victims' families, and just maybe it can help prevent the loss of even more lives. All of this is what's important to me.